The convoy had been 11 ships. 4 made it to Halworth Relief Station, and one of those was towing pieces of a 5th. Mari Kade was already moving before the docking klaxon finished its first cycle, boots slapping the grated floor of Bay 9, medkit strap cutting into her shoulder, counting triage colors on the manifest scrolling across her cuff display faster than any sane system should have pushed it. 41 survivors confirmed. Manifest said 63 had left the Ithresh relay point 4 days ago. She did not do the subtraction out loud. She never did the subtraction out loud. Kade, forward hatch now. Warden Captain Tomas Adami's voice came flat and hard through her earpiece, the voice he used when the schedule had already stopped mattering. 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades being underestimated and had stopped minding it, he was the only human on Halworth Station with more seniority than the council-issued furniture. We've got a hull breach case coming through triage blind. And Kade, there's a discrepancy on the child count. Manifest says 12 minors boarded at the relay point. Only 11 came off the last ship. Copy? Mari didn't slow down. Discrepancies were a Directorate problem, and the Directorate could wait until the bleeding stopped. The forward hatch cycled open on a scene she'd seen a dozen times, and had still never gotten good at seeing. Refugees blinking against gravity that wasn't the gravity they'd left home in, clutching bags that held everything they still owned, moving in the specific stunned shuffle of people whose ship had been shot at until it stopped being a ship. Ithresh physiology ran pale under stress, silver capillary lines rising visible beneath translucent skin, and the crowd coming off the transport looked like a wall of cracked porcelain lit from within. Mari's eyes went where they always went first, low, to the children, because children hid injuries better than adults and paid for it later. She found the 12th one sitting against a bulkhead 30 meters back from the crowd, apart from it, small enough to have been missed twice already by triage sweeps that were built to count bodies in motion, not bodies that had stopped moving on purpose. Female presenting by Ithresh convention, maybe 8 or 9 years by human years, both hearts visible as a double flutter beneath a torn jacket collar where the fabric had burned through. No manifest tag on her wrist. Just a fistful of scorched cloth pressed to her chest with both hands, the kind of grip that had stopped being about holding something and started being about not letting go of the last thing that still made sense. Hey, Mari crouched 3 meters off, low, hands visible, voice pitched the way she'd learned pitching a voice for a species she hadn't grown up around, soft register, no threat, patient. I'm not going to touch you unless you say I can. Can you tell me if you're hurt? The girl's eyes came up. Dark, too large for her face the way all Ithresh eyes were too large for their faces, and behind them something Mari recognized immediately and hated recognizing, because she'd cataloged that exact look in 4 other species' children in 3 years on the station. Not fear. Fear past. This was past fear. This was a child doing arithmetic she was too young to be doing, working out how many people who had been alive 4 days ago were not alive now, and getting an answer she couldn't put down. 614. The girl's voice was a whisper in accented trade tongue, reciting a processing number like it was the only fact she trusted anymore. That's what they said, on the ship, before. That's not a name, Mari said. That's a number somebody gave you because it was faster than asking. I'm going to ask instead. What's your name? The girl looked at her for a long moment, silver lines pulsing faint under her skin in a rhythm Mari didn't have a translation for yet, and didn't answer. Okay, Mari said, not pushing. That's okay, I'm Mari. I'm going to sit with you until the number stops mattering, is that all right? A jerky nod. Mari eased down against the bulkhead beside her, close enough to be a presence, far enough not to crowd, and ran a scanner along the girl's arm without making contact. Surface burns, a hairline crack in the radius that would need a brace but not surgery, exhaustion deep enough to register as a medical finding in its own right. Nothing that explained why a child would be sitting alone 30 meters from the only people left who spoke her language. Kade, Adami's voice again, quieter now, standing at the edge of her attention rather than in the middle of it. He'd crossed the bay without her noticing, which for a man his size and age was its own kind of skill. He looked down at the girl, then at the absence of a manifest tag on her wrist, and something in his face went carefully, deliberately neutral in a way Mari had learned to read as him hiding a reaction, not lacking one. She wasn't on the transport's passenger log. She's on the relay point's departure log. Somebody removed her from the ship's own manifest sometime in the last 4 days and didn't bother telling the ship. Somebody or the ship's crew. Ship's crew is dead, Kade. All 4 flight officers. The convoy commander logged it as hostile fire 11 hours before the surviving hulls reached us. Adami crouched, joints protesting audibly, and kept his voice at the same soft register Mari had used, though it sat strangely in a voice that deep. She's the only unlogged passenger on 4 ships that lost 60% of their people to a strike nobody's claimed responsibility for yet. That's not a paperwork error. That's a pattern with a shape I don't like. Mari looked down at the scorched cloth still pressed against the girl's chest, and for the first time actually looked at it instead of past it. Not a blanket, not clothing. A banner, or what was left of one. A triangular scrap of heavy fabric, edges cauterized black, one corner still holding the ghost of an embroidered device too damaged to read. Ithresh houses carried banners the way old Earth families had once carried crests. This one had survived a fire that had killed the people who'd carried it. "What house is that?" Mari asked, careful to keep the question light, half to the girl, half to Adami. The girl's grip on the cloth tightened until her knuckles went pale gray. "I don't know either," Adami admitted. "But somebody on this station is going to, and I'd put money on us not liking who asks first." He was right within the hour. Adami walked with her from the docking bay toward the intake office. The girl settled for the moment in a nurse's care, and used the 10 minutes it took to cross the station to say the thing he apparently judged she needed to hear before whatever came through that door arrived. Earth signed the Tributary Labor Accord 9 years ago. Kade, 3 years after the assessment fleet decided we were more useful upright than conquered. He didn't slow his pace saying it, the way a man recites a fact he's tired of being true. It bought us provisional council standing instead of occupation. It also means every human posted off-world works these stations at the Directorate's pleasure, not the Council's protection, replaceable, reviewable, and about as politically expensive to lose as a broken instrument panel. I've watched good people get quietly rotated home for a lot less than what you're about to do. What am I about to do? Whatever this liaison's here for, you're going to decide inside about 4 seconds whether that girl's case is a paperwork problem or a person, and I've watched you long enough to already know which way you'll land. Adami's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm not telling you not to. I'm telling you what it costs, so it doesn't surprise you later. 9 years of provisional standing doesn't buy you the right to make this directorate's decisions for it. It just buys you the right to be present in the room when they're made badly. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It isn't. It's also not enough most days. Today might be different. I don't know yet. They reached the intake office door, and he held it for her with the same unhurried courtesy he extended to everything on this station that had earned it. Whatever happens in there, Kade, I've got your back. That's not Directorate policy. That's just true. The Repatriation Directorate's local liaison arrived at Halworth Station with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his career needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. And Overseer Padron Sesk did not raise it now, standing in the doorway of the station's intake office with a data slate under one arm like it was an extension of his forearm. Overseer. Adami's greeting carried exactly as much warmth as regulation required, and not 1 degree more. You made good time. 40 confirmed refugees from a convoy incident, is the kind of event that moves quickly through Directorate channels. Warden Captain. Sesk's trade tongue carried the flat, cultivated precision of someone who had spoken it since birth and used it as a tool rather than a language. He was tall, gray-skinned, unremarkable in the particular way senior bureaucrats across 100 species tended to converge on unremarkable. Nothing about him invited a second look, which Mari had learned over 3 years to treat as its own kind of warning. I'm here regarding one specific case. Processing designation 614. Unaccompanied minor, no manifest record, Ithresh physiology. Mari, standing at the edge of the office where she'd been finishing an equipment log she suddenly didn't care about anymore, felt something in her chest go very still. She has a medical hold on her, Mari said before Adami could answer for her. Hairline fracture, exhaustion, unprocessed trauma. I haven't cleared her for transfer to general refugee housing yet, let alone off station. Sesk's gaze moved to her with the mild, unbothered patience of a man reviewing an inventory discrepancy. And you are auxiliary medical staff. Human, I note, under the Earth Tributary Labor Accord. Warden Kade, Adami said, is this station's senior triage officer, and her medical hold stands until she lifts it. I have no argument with her medical hold, Sesk said, and something about the ease of the concession made Mari like it less rather than more. The Directorate is not asking to move the child today. I'm here to open the file. Designation 614 has been identified, through genetic cross-reference against the Ithresh Homeworld Registry, as a surviving minor of the Vantic bloodline, formerly a ruling lineage on Ithresh Prime. Currently, a small, precise pause, the kind a careful man used instead of a word he decided not to say out loud, extinct, with this exception. The office went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with anyone deciding to be quiet. Extinct how, Mari said. That is not information the Directorate is authorized to share with auxiliary personnel, Sesk said, not unkindly, the way a man declines a question he considers reasonable to ask and unreasonable to answer. What I am authorized to share is this. Ithresh Prime's Governing Council, the Corvine Assembly, which assumed administration of the homeworld 11 years ago, has submitted a kinship reclamation request under Council Repatriation Statute 41. As the child's designated planetary government, the Assembly has standing to request custody of any surviving minor of Ithresh blood, regardless of prior lineage, for the purpose of what the statute terms reintegration. Reintegration, Adami repeated flat. And nobody at the Directorate found it worth double-checking why a government that assumed power 11 years ago is only now filing to reclaim a child whose bloodline it replaced, Mari said. 11 years is a long time to wait to ask for family back. The statute does not require the Directorate to evaluate a requesting government's motive, Warden Kade. Only its standing. Sesk's tone stayed level, but something in the phrasing does not require asterisk, rather than does not permit, told Mari he'd noticed the gap too and simply wasn't paid to close it. The statute's language, not mine. Sesk set the data slate on the intake counter, and for the first time something almost apologetic crossed his face. Not for the situation, Mari understood immediately, but for the paperwork of it, for having to be the one standing in this office reciting it. I am required to inform you that the Directorate has 40 hours from this notification to process the transfer, per statute. I would ask that 614, he paused again, correcting himself with visible effort, an old bureaucrat's habit, that the child be made available for a Directorate medical review at the end of that window, so that a transfer vessel can be scheduled. 40 hours, Mari said. The statute is specific about timelines. It exists, Warden Kade, to prevent exactly the kind of prolonged custody dispute that leaves a child in institutional limbo. I understand it reads as abrupt. It is designed to be abrupt. Abruptness, in the Directorate's experience, causes less harm than delay. Sesk picked the slate back up, tucked it under his arm again, and inclined his head with the small, correct courtesy of a man who believed himself entirely reasonable. "I'll return in 39 hours. Good evening, Warden Captain, Warden Kade." He left. The door hissed shut behind him with a sound too soft for what had just happened in the room. "Tomas." Mari kept her voice level with an effort that cost her something physical. The last ruling family on a world got wiped out to a single surviving child. 4 days after that child's convoy got hit by unclaimed hostile fire, and the government that replaced them wants her handed over inside 40 hours. No questions, under a statute built for custody disputes between grandparents. "I heard the same briefing you did." Adami's jaw worked once, the only outward sign that anything in him had moved. "I've been on this station 6 years, Kade. I've watched the directorate process worse than this and call it paperwork. That doesn't mean I believe it's paperwork. It means I know exactly how much room there is to argue with a statute number, which is none, and how much room there is to ask questions the statute doesn't cover, which is more than Sesk wants either of us to think." "What questions?" "Start with who fired on that convoy," Adami said. "And ask yourself why the only child on 4 ships who ended up with no name on the manifest is the one child on Ithresh Prime whose bloodline the current government has apparently decided is finished." Mari looked at the closed door Sesk had walked out through, at the calm, unhurried shape of the 40 hours he just handed her like a receipt, and felt the particular cold clarity settle into her that she associated later with every decision in her life that had turned out to matter. "I'm not handing her to anyone in 39 hours, she said. "Not until somebody tells me the truth about what happened to that convoy." Adami looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Mari braced for the lecture about tributary status, about what Earth's fragile standing bought and didn't buy on a council station, about careers and contracts, and the specific kind of disappearing that happened to auxiliary staff who made themselves inconvenient to a directorate liaison. It didn't come. "Good," he said instead. "Because I already pulled the convoy commander's final transmission before Sesk's people could quietly lose it, and you're going to want to see what's in it before those 39 hours run out." The convoy commander's final transmission was 4 seconds long, badly compressed, recorded in the last minute before her ship stopped transmitting anything at all, a woman's voice, Ithresh accented, flat with the specific calm of someone reciting coordinates she expected to be the last useful thing she ever said. "Hostile signature matches Corving naval configuration. Repeat, hostile is Corving. They are not intercepting. They are hunting The transmission cut there. Adami had played it 4 times in the station's back office before Mari arrived, and it still ended in the same place. Mid-sentence, on the word asterisk the asterisk, with whatever noun had come next lost to whatever had killed the woman saying it. "Hunting Mari said. "Hunting the ship, the convoy, the child," Adami finished because somebody had to say it and he'd apparently decided it might as well be him. "I've run this transmission against every noun that fits the grammar, Kade. Ship doesn't fit, she'd have said us. Not the convoy's already implied by everything before it. The by itself, cut off like that, is what you say right before a proper noun, a designation, a name." So the Corvin Assembly's own navy attacked its own refugee convoy, killed 60% of the people on it, including every flight officer who could contradict the story. And then the Assembly's government turned around and requested lawful custody of the one survivor it apparently wanted dead in the first place. "That's the part I can't make sense of," Adami admitted. "If Corvin wanted her dead, they had her. 4 ships, minimal escort, open space. Why not finish it there, instead of filing a repatriation statute through channels that put her name in a council database forever?" Mari thought about the 8-year-old sitting against a bulkhead, silver lines pulsing under skin too thin to hide anything, and felt something click into place with the unpleasant clarity of a lock she hadn't wanted to pick. Because a dead heir is a martyr, she said slowly. A body's proof. A body's a rallying point for anybody on Ithresh Prime who still remembers the Vantic line and doesn't love the Corvin assembly. But a child who was quietly repatriated, processed, reintegrated, that's not a martyr. That's a paperwork footnote. Nobody starts a resistance around a case number. Ademi was quiet for a long moment. You're saying the attack on the convoy wasn't meant to kill her. I'm saying the attack on the convoy was meant to kill everyone around her who could tell a different story about who she is once she's back on Corvin soil. The convoy commander who could testify the assembly fired first. The flight officers who logged the hostile signature. Anyone who knew her well enough to recognize her later and say she wasn't who the assembly's paperwork was about to say she was. Mari's voice had gone very flat, very controlled, the way it did when the alternative was letting it shake. They needed her alive and unwitnessed. That's not a rescue, Tomas. That's evidence tampering with a heartbeat. And the Directorate's 40-hour statute hands her straight back into it. Ademi rubbed a hand over his jaw, the gesture of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. Sesk either doesn't know that, or knows it and doesn't care, because the Repatriation Directorate's entire budget line depends on the Assembly's tribute cooperation staying friendly, and one unaccompanied refugee child is not a number that shows up on the Directorate's quarterly reports. Then we don't send it up through the Directorate, Mari said. Kade, you said it yourself. There's no room to argue with a statute number. There's room to ask questions the statute doesn't cover. She looked at him, and something in her voice hardened into a shape she recognized from 3 years of watching this man quietly bend rules that deserved bending. I need everything you can pull without Sesk's people noticing, convoy logs, weapons signature analysis, anything that proves Corvin fired first and did it on purpose. And I need it before he comes back for his medical review, because the second she's inside a Directorate transfer vessel, none of it matters anymore. Ademi looked at her for a long moment, and something that might have been pride, or might have been the specific weariness of a man who had seen this exact resolve get people killed before, moved behind his eyes. 38 hours, he said. Let's not waste any of them. Her name was Sale. She told Mari 2 hours later, sitting cross-legged on a cot in the station's small medical bay with the scorched banner still in her lap, in a voice so quiet Mari had to lean in to catch it over the hum of the ventilation. Sale Vantic, she said. That was my grandmother's name too. They said I shouldn't say the second part out loud on the ship. My mother said it before. You don't have to say it out loud here if you don't want to, Mari said. You already know it, Sale said, with the flat, unblinking directness of a child who had already learned that adults lied less when they thought you already had the facts. The gray man knew it too. That's why he came. His name's Sesk, and yeah. He knew. Mari sat on the edge of the cot, close enough to be steady, far enough to leave room. Sale, I need to ask you something, and you can tell me it's too much and I'll stop. Do you remember what happened on the ship before? Sale's fingers tightened on the banner. For a long moment Mari thought she wasn't going to answer, and started composing the sentence that would let her off the hook. That's okay. We don't have to asterisk. When the girl spoke instead, fast and flat, the way you say a thing you've been carrying so it stops being only yours. There was a woman, Captain Aura. She put me in the crew hold before the ship started shooting, told me to stay under the floor plate, told me not to come out no matter what I heard. Sale's eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere 4 days and a long way from this cot. I heard a lot. I stayed under the plate. When it stopped, I came out, and Captain Aura she stopped, restarted. She wasn't going to come get me herself. So I came out by myself, and there wasn't anyone left on the crew deck to ask if I should, so I went and found the passenger manifest terminal, and I deleted my own name off it, before the transport crew that picked us up could log me. Mari went very still. You erased your own manifest entry. At 8 years old, in the middle of an attack that just killed your entire escort. 9, Sale said, with the small, fierce correction of a child whose age was one of the last facts she still had full ownership of. And my mother told me, before all of this, she said if anything ever happened and I was alone, I shouldn't let anyone write my name down anywhere until I found someone I trusted to tell it to first. She said names are how they find you. Sale looked up, and for the first time since the docking bay, something other than grief moved across her face. A flicker of calculation, sharp and old for 9 years, the look of a child who had inherited more than a banner from a dead ruling line. I don't know if I trust you yet. But you didn't try to make me say it in front of the gray man, so I'm telling you now instead of him. Mari felt something in her chest crack quietly down the middle, and didn't let it reach her face. Okay, she said. Sale, that's a good name. I'm glad you told me. She glanced at the banner in the girl's lap, at the ruined embroidery still faintly visible at one corner. Is that your house's device? It's the only piece of it that came off the ship. Sale's hand flattened over it, protective, absolute. Everything else is on Ithresh Prime, or it's Ash, or it's the assemblies now. This is what's left. Then we're going to make sure it's not the last piece, Mari said, and meant it as a promise before she'd finished deciding whether she had any right to make one. Mari found a Damie in the observation gallery above the general refugee wing an hour later, watching the rest of the convoy's survivors settle into temporary quarters through a window built, decades ago, for exactly this purpose. So a handful of overworked staff could keep an eye on several hundred displaced people without walking every corridor in person. 41 confirmed, 12 of them minors, one of them apparently a state secret, he said, without turning around. You want to tell me why Ithresh Prime's governing council would rather quietly reclaim a 9-year-old than let the rest of the galaxy watch her grow up in a refugee ledger? I don't know yet. Mari leaned against the rail beside him, watching a cluster of younger Ithresh children being shown to a dormitory bunk by a station aide who didn't speak their dialect and was making do anyway with patient gestures. But I know it's not about paperwork. Nobody drafts a kinship reclamation statute request inside 4 days of a convoy attack unless the request was already sitting drafted somewhere, waiting for a body count to finish. That's a hard thing to prove. It's a hard thing to disprove too, Mari said, which is usually how you know it's true. Below them, in the dormitory, one of the smaller children looked up toward the gallery window and for a moment seemed to be looking directly at Mari, the specific unnerving stillness of a species whose eyes read as too large for comfort until you got used to it. A Damie didn't miss it either. 41 people made it off 4 ships that started with 63, he said quietly. Every single one of them is going to spend the rest of their life doing the same math you and I have been doing all morning, Kade. Whatever's true about the 12th kid, it's not the only reason this convoy matters. It's just the reason we found out about first. Mari didn't have an answer for that and didn't try to build one. She thought instead about Sale's grip on a scorched banner 3 decks below, and about a captain named Aura who told a 9-year-old to hide under a floor plate and then hadn't lived long enough to come get her out from under it. I'm going to go check on her again, Mari said. Figured you would. A Damie didn't look away from the window. Kade, whatever this turns into, you're not doing it alone. I want that understood before it turns into anything. Understood, Mari said and meant it, and went back down to the medical bay, not yet knowing how soon she'd need to remember he'd said it. Vec Asen arrived on Halworth Station 11 hours later, in the guise of a Directorate transfer technician, with credentials so clean a Damie's own security clearance couldn't flag them as anything but genuine. Because they were genuine, issued through a repatriation directorate subcontract that the Corvin Assembly's tribute status entitled it to use. A loophole so mundane and so legal that nobody on the station's roster had ever thought to check whether a transfer technician and a reconciliation agent might, on Ithresh Prime, be the same job title on different letterhead. He came to the medical bay at the top of the night shift, when the corridor traffic thinned and the duty roster ran 2 staff instead of 6, carrying a standard-issue diagnostic kit and asking, with perfect bureaucratic patience, for a pre-transfer wellness scan on designation 614, per Overseer Sesk's authorization, filed and time-stamped 4 hours before the 40-hour Window's official close. It was the timestamp that saved Sale's life. Mari, working a double shift specifically so no one else would be alone in the medical bay with the girl during the transfer window, noticed it a full 90 seconds before Asen reached the cot, noticed that Sesk's stated schedule had put the medical review at the end of the 40 hours, not 4 hours early, and that no revised authorization had come through any channel she had access to. "That paperwork's premature," she said, stepping into the aisle between Asen and the cot with a casualness that cost her everything she had to fake. "Overseer Sesk's review is scheduled for the end of the window. You're 4 hours ahead of his own timeline." Administrative adjustment. Asen's trade tongue was even more precise than Sesk's had been, and his smile arrived exactly on cue, exactly the right width, the practiced smile of someone who had learned expressions the way other people learned languages. "The Directorate moved the schedule up to accommodate transport availability. I'm sure the notification is in your queue somewhere." "It isn't." Mari kept her voice level, kept her body where it was, angled just enough that Sale, still and silent on the cot behind her, had gone half out of Asen's direct line without either of them making it look deliberate. "I run this bay's schedule myself. I'd have the notification before you did." Something in Asen's face didn't change so much as it stopped bothering to perform. For half a second, the particular stillness of a man recalculating whether the fastest path to what he wanted still ran through patience. His hand, resting on the diagnostic kit, shifted its grip in a way that had nothing to do with diagnostics. Mari had spent 3 years learning to read a room for the moment violence stopped being a possibility and started being a decision already made. She'd learned it in a defunct Earth Auxiliary Corps unit that had existed for exactly 4 bad years during the early assessment period, back when Earth's provisional status meant every human posting doubled as a crash course in staying alive around people who did not consider you the point of the room. She read it now, in the half-second before Asen's hand cleared the kit's lid, and she was already moving when the kit's false bottom released a blade no diagnostic tool had any legitimate reason to carry. She didn't fight him elegantly. There was nothing elegant in it. She got a supply cart between them by main force, sent a rack of sealed instrument trays crashing into Asen's shins hard enough to buy 2 seconds, and used those 2 seconds to slam her palm flat against the bay's emergency lockdown control, the one thing on the station that answered to a warden's authority faster than it answered to a directorate credential. Alarms cut the air. Blast doors began grinding down over the bay's 2 exits. Asen, calculating with the same cold speed he'd brought to everything else, abandoned the blade and the diagnostic kit both and went for the narrowing gap in the nearest door, gone into the corridor beyond a half-second before it sealed, leaving behind nothing but a kit full of forged paperwork and a knife that had no business existing inside it. Mari stood with her back against the sealed door, breathing hard, and turned to find Sale already off the cot, pressed into the corner between 2 equipment racks with the banner clutched against her chest and both hearts visible fluttering fast enough to see through her skin. "He wasn't a technician," Sale said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Mari said. "He wasn't." Adami arrived at a dead run less than 90 seconds after the lockdown alarm cleared the general channel, badge already in hand, and took one look at the confiscated diagnostic kit's false bottom before his face went carefully, deliberately blank in the way Mari had learned meant he was furious and choosing, for now, not to show it. "Station security's already got the corridor footage," he said. "Whoever he is, He knew this station's layout well enough to find a gap in a locked door in under a second. That's not something you improvise. That's something you're briefed on. Briefed by who? That's the question I intend to have an answer to before Sesk gets anywhere near this room again. Adami crouched by the kit, careful not to touch the blade still lying where Mari had left it, and studied the forged paperwork scattered across the counter, with the focused attention of a man cataloging evidence he already suspected he wouldn't get to keep once the Directorate's own people arrived to collect it. Get me copies of everything in this kit before Sesk's people take the originals into custody, Kade. Every page, every credential, every timestamp. If this turns into his word against ours, I want our copy sitting somewhere his authority doesn't reach. Mari was already photographing the paperwork page by page with her own cuff display, hands steadier now than they'd been 90 seconds into the fight, the particular calm that arrived. She'd learned over 3 years, exactly after the danger passed rather than during it. You think he's going to make it disappear? I think a man who signs his own name to something usually finds a reason it stopped existing once the something goes wrong, Adami said. I've been doing this 6 years, Kade. I've watched paperwork disappear for less. Sale, still pressed into the corner between the equipment racks, watched them work with the same intent, cataloging focus she'd brought to everything since the docking bay, not flinching now, but watching, the way a child learns to watch when the adults around her stop being reliably safe. He's going to say it was a mistake, she said quietly. That's what they always say when they get caught. It was a misunderstanding. Nobody meant it. Maybe, Mari said, but a misunderstanding doesn't carry a blade nobody puts in a diagnostic kit by accident. Whatever he says, Sale, the kit doesn't lie even if the paperwork does. We've got that much now. Sale considered this, silver lines settling slowly back toward calm. Good, she said. I want them to have to explain the knife. Overseer Sesk arrived within the hour, and Mari watched him look at the forged diagnostic kit, the blade, the security footage of a man walking calmly out of a locked medical bay through a gap no ordinary technician should have been quick enough to find, and watched him decide in real time to call it something smaller than what it was. A serious security lapse, Sesk said, turning the confiscated blade over once in gloved hands before setting it down with the careful precision of a man handling something he intended to make disappear from a report rather than an investigation. I'll have the Directorate's contracting office review this sub-agency's credentialing process. In the meantime, the child remains in your custody, Warden Kade, until the review concludes. That man tried to kill her, Mari said, in a medical bay wearing Directorate credentials your own office issued. I'd like to know how the Directorate intends to answer for that before we talk about credentialing reviews. I understand your alarm. Sesk's face did the same careful, correct performance of concern it had done in the intake office, and Mari understood, watching it, that this was simply what the man's face did, a permanent posture of reasonable regret that cost him nothing and committed him to less. I also have a statute clock that does not stop for a security incident, Warden Kade, however serious. The 40-hour window closes in 29 hours. I will be requesting an armed Directorate escort for the transfer, given tonight's events. That should resolve your concern about the child's safety far more effectively than an indefinite custody hold this office has no statutory authority to grant. You want to hand her to an armed escort from the same channel that just tried to put a knife in her, Mari said, and heard her own voice go flat and hard in a way she didn't try to soften. I want to follow the statute, Warden Kade, because the statute is the only thing standing between this station and a diplomatic incident with a tribute government whose cooperation feeds 11,000 refugees a year through this Directorate's processing network. For the first time, something like genuine strain showed under Sesk's careful surface. Not cruelty, Mari understood with a chill worse than cruelty would have been, but the specific exhaustion of a man who had learned to treat a child's life as one line item balanced against many others, and had gotten good enough at the balancing that he no longer noticed the weight on either side of the scale. I did not design this system. I administer it. If you have evidence the Corvin Assembly orchestrated tonight's attempt, take it to the Council's Repatriation Oversight Board. That channel exists. It is also slow, Warden Kade, and you have 29 hours, and I would ask you not to mistake my patience with your insubordination tonight for permission to obstruct a lawful transfer when the clock runs out. He left the same way he'd left the first time, unhurried, correct, the door hissing shut behind him on a silence that felt, this time, like the sound of a door that would not open again in Sale's favor. Adami found Mari standing in the corridor outside the sealed bay 10 minutes later, staring at nothing, both fists closed hard enough that her nails had left marks. 29 hours, she said before he could ask. And an oversight board that Sesk himself just told me was too slow to matter. Then we don't file with the oversight board, Adami said. We take it somewhere the clock doesn't apply. Where? Every council station this size carries an emergency relay uplink, he said. Old system, predates the Directorate's whole network, installed back when this moon was a mining outpost, and the nearest help was 3 weeks out by ordinary courier. It's meant for exactly one thing, an unfiltered, unbuffered channel straight to a sitting council magistrate, bypassing every administrative layer in between, for use only when a station's own chain of command has failed. It hasn't been triggered in this station's operating history. I know because I'm the one who's supposed to authorize it, and I've never had cause to. You have cause now. I have cause now, Adami agreed, and something in his voice, old, tired, and entirely unafraid, told Mari he'd already made the decision before she asked. But triggering it without hard evidence is its own kind of career-ending mistake, Kade, and I intend for us to have the evidence in hand before I burn the one lever this station's ever given me. Which means before the clock runs out, we need Corvin's weapons signature confirmed beyond argument. We need Asen's forged credentials traced back to whoever actually authorized them inside the Directorate's own contracting chain. And we need it all sitting in a data packet clean enough that a magistrate on the other end of that relay can't dismiss it as a grieving station making excuses. How long does gathering that take? Longer than 29 hours done carefully, Adami's jaw set, which means we're not doing it carefully. We're doing it fast, and we're doing it while keeping that girl breathing, and both of those things are going to cost us. They worked through what remained of the night in the station's old maintenance archive. A low-ceilinged room 3 decks down from the medical bay that nobody on the Directorate staff roster had entered in years, because nothing in it had been upgraded since the mining outpost days, and nothing in the Directorate's modern workflow required it to be. It was exactly the kind of forgotten infrastructure Mari had learned, growing up on an Earth still climbing out from under its own occupation-era rebuilding, to trust more than anything shiny. Analog backups, hardwired logs, systems too old and too boring for anyone competent to bother sabotaging. Adami pulled the convoy's original weapons signature telemetry from a backup relay buried in the archive's dead storage. A system so far outside the Directorate's current network that Sesk's people had never thought to purge it, because they didn't know it existed. Cross-referenced against Corvin Naval Hull Registry's 3 separate ways, the signature came back a clean, undeniable match. Not Raider hardware, not pirate salvage, but a first-line Corvin Assembly Patrol cruiser's weapons suite, logged departing a Corvin naval yard 9 hours before the attack and returning 11 hours after, on a flight plan that intersected the convoy's route with a precision no coincidence could explain. Sale, curled on a decommissioned crate in the corner of the archive with the banner across her lap, watched them work with the intent, exhausted focus of a child who had decided sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford until the number stopped mattering. "That's the ship that came for us," she said quietly, when Mari pulled the hull silhouette up on the archive's ancient display. "I saw it out the crew hold viewport, before Captain Aura put me under the floor plate." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Sail's silver lines pulsed once sharp. "It had a mark on the hull. Here." She traced a shape in the air, small and precise, and Mari matched it a moment later against the Corvin naval crest catalogued in the registry cross-reference. An exact hit. One more piece of a case that no longer had any gaps a reasonable magistrate could talk their way around. They were 3 hours into the trace when the archive's old proximity sensor, another piece of forgotten hardware nobody, administering the modern grid remembered existed, chimed once, soft and analog, and Adami went still with the particular stillness of a man who had just heard a very old alarm do exactly the job it had been built for. "Patrol," he said, voice dropped to almost nothing. "Directorate sweep corridor above us, not scheduled. Sesk's tightening the net early." Mari killed every active display in the room by hand, one switch at a time, because the archive's ancient wiring didn't trust anything as fast as a master cutoff, and pulled Sail down behind the same decommissioned crate the girl had been sitting on all night. Footsteps passed overhead, unhurried, methodical, the sound of people checking rooms off a list rather than people who knew what they were looking for. Sail's breathing had gone shallow and controlled beside her, a 9-year-old holding still with a discipline Mari had only ever seen in soldiers 3 times her age. And Mari understood, in that dark, silent minute, exactly how much practice this child had already been given at not being found. The footsteps moved on. Adami let out a breath he'd been holding since the sensor chimed, and brought the displays back up one at a time, slower this time, listening between each one. "They don't know this room exists," he said. "They're checking the ones that do. That buys us time, not safety. There's a difference, and I want you clear on it before we go any further." "I'm clear," Mari said. Beside her, Sail had gone quiet in a different way, not frightened quiet, but the particular stillness of a child turning something over that had been sitting unsaid for 4 days. "My mother used to say the assembly would never actually look for us properly," she said, so softly Mari almost missed it under the archive's ventilation hum. "She said looking properly costs something, and the assembly only ever spends what it has to. She was wrong about the ship. She wasn't wrong about the rest of it. They didn't send their best people after me, not really. They sent one man with good paperwork and hoped that would be enough, because looking properly would have meant admitting out loud that a 9-year-old was worth being afraid of." "Is that what you think this is?" Mari asked. "Them being afraid of you?" "I think," Sail said, with the careful precision of a child repeating something she'd turned over many times without fully deciding if she believed it, "that a dead line doesn't need this much paperwork to stay dead. Only a line somebody's still afraid might not be finished." She looked up, silver lines pulsing steady now instead of frantic. "My mother would have liked that you didn't let them decide it was finished either." Mari didn't have an answer that felt big enough for that, so she didn't try to build one. She put a hand briefly on the girl's shoulder, felt the small, steady double pulse of both hearts under her palm, and went back to the trace with Adami, because the clock in the corner of the display hadn't stopped running just because the corridor outside had gone quiet again. The credential trace itself very nearly beat them. Directorate contracting logs were built, deliberately, to make exactly this kind of search expensive, encrypted in 5 overlapping layers, each one routed through a different subagency's authentication server, the whole structure designed less to stop a determined investigator than to exhaust one. Adami worked it the way Mari had watched him work every piece of stubborn old hardware on this station, methodically, without hurry, treating each dead end as information rather than defeat. "Whoever built this wanted it slow to open and easy to lose interest in," he muttered, 3 failed authentication attempts into the 4th layer. "That's not security, that's fatigue management." Somebody in the Directorate's legal office knows exactly how many investigators give up around Layer 3. You're not giving up at Layer 3. I've had 6 years of practice being more stubborn than the paperwork, Ademi said, and on the 5th attempt the 4th layer finally gave, and the 5th behind it faster, because whoever had built the encryption had spent their cleverness on the early layers and assumed, correctly 9 times out of 10, that nobody would still be trying by the time they reached the last one. He was right about the 10th time being different. It took him 40 more minutes, and it left him looking older than Mari had ever seen him look. But when the final layer opened, Padron Sesk's credential seal sat behind it exactly where the 9th layer had promised it would, time-stamped, unambiguous, 4 hours before a man with a forged diagnostic kit had walked calmly toward a 9-year-old's cot. That approval chain ran, cleanly and undeniably, through a signature Mari recognized the instant it resolved on the screen. Padron Sesk's own credential seal, applied 4 hours before he ever walked into the intake office to introduce himself. He knew, Mari said very quietly, before he ever told us about the statute, before he ever said Asen's name to us at all. He'd already signed off on the man who came to kill her. Or he signed off on paperwork he didn't read closely enough to notice what it actually authorized, Ademi said, and even he didn't sound like he believed it. Doesn't matter which, Kade. Either way, that seal is the piece that turns this from a tragedy the council can shrug at into a directorate official's name on a document that put an assassin in a medical bay. That's the piece a magistrate can't wave off. Mari looked at the timestamp on the packet they'd assembled, evidence enough, finally, to be more than a station's excuses, and then at the clock counting down in the corner of the archive's display. 6 hours remained on Sesk's 40-hour window. Trigger the relay, she said. Ademi didn't move for a moment, and when he did, his hand on the old, unfamiliar activation panel carried the particular steadiness of a man doing something he'd spent 6 years hoping he'd never have to do, and doing it anyway because the alternative had finally become worse. The relay didn't answer. Not immediately, not in any of the ways Mari had braced for. A status light blinked from red to amber and stayed there, uplink established, packet transmitting, acknowledgement pending, and pending was where it stayed, through the last hour of the night shift, through breakfast none of them ate, through Sale falling asleep at last against Mari's shoulder somewhere around the archive's version of dawn, one small hand still fisted in the burned edge of her banner even in sleep. It was still pending 4 hours later, when Overseer Sesk's voice came over the station's general channel, calm and correct as ever, informing all staff that the Directorate's armed transfer escort had arrived early, and that designation 614's transfer would proceed within the hour. The escort was 6 armed Directorate contractors and Sesk himself, and they came for the medical bay first, exactly where the schedule said Sale should be, which was precisely why she wasn't there. Ademi's warning had reached Mari 4 minutes before Sesk's announcement went out to the general channel. Routed through a maintenance priority line, the Directorate's security grid didn't monitor, because nobody administering it remembered auxiliary staff still had access to it. 2 words terse enough to have cost him breath he didn't have to spare. Move now. She hadn't asked questions. She'd spent 3 years learning that the difference between a warning that saved someone and a warning that arrived too late was almost never the content of the message. It was whether the person receiving it wasted time deciding whether to trust it. She'd had Sale off the medical bay cot, banner and all, before the general announcement finished its first sentence. Where, Sale had said, not frightened, just fast, already moving with her. Somewhere they don't know to look. Mari had kept low, kept to the corridor's inner wall, away from the wider maintenance junctions where a patrol's sweep pattern would naturally track. Ademi's buying us a head start. We're not wasting it standing still. They'd made it 2 corridors before the first near miss. A Directorate contractor rounding a junction ahead of them, close enough that Mari heard his boots before she saw him, and pulled sail hard sideways into a service alcove meant for cargo lifters, pressing them both flat against cold bulkhead while the contractor's footsteps passed 6 feet away without slowing. Sail hadn't made a sound. She'd had, Mari thought grimly, 4 days of practice at exactly this. Behind them, on a security frequency Mari wasn't supposed to be monitoring, Adami's voice had cut in, feeding the search team a sweep pattern that sent them methodically checking every populated section of the station, except the 3 decks where the old maintenance archive sat forgotten. A diversion built out of the same 6 years of patient, unglamorous knowledge that had found the archive's dead storage relay in the first place. He was spending everything he had left of his own authority to send a search the wrong direction, and he was doing it in a voice pitched exactly as calm as Sesk's had ever been, because a diversion that sounded like panic was a diversion that got noticed. They'd reached the maintenance archive's back corridor at the 9-minute mark, and it was there, in the low, dim service passage nobody had upgraded since the mining outpost days, that Mari had finally let herself believe they might make it. A belief that lasted exactly as long as it took a second patrol, coming from the opposite direction this time, to catch the edge of her shadow against the corridor's one working emergency light. There, a voice not Sesk's flat and urgent. Movement, service corridor 9. Mari hadn't looked back to see how close. She'd grabbed Sail's hand, banner and all, and run the last 80 meters the way she'd once run drills in an Earth auxiliary unit that had trained for exactly this, and never told its recruits why. Cutting through a maintenance junction, 2 patrols back would have to backtrack to find, down a stairwell no modern directory listed, into the old relay chapel's back corridor with a lead she judged, afterward, at perhaps 90 seconds. Not much, but enough. Because 90 seconds was exactly as long as it took to get a heavy old door shut, and a decommissioned storage rack dragged into its frame. Mari had chosen the chapel 2 hours before any of that started, on instinct more than plan, the moment she'd first walked its floor plan during her earlier infrastructure check, and found a small, disused room 3 decks below general traffic, built during the mining outpost era as a multi-faith meditation space, and left standing, unused and unremarked, because nothing in the Directorate's modern facility plan required tearing it down. It had 1 door, thick and old pattern, a backup power junction that predated the station's current grid by 2 decades, and Mari had checked, methodically, the way Adami's 6 years of quiet infrastructure paranoia had apparently rubbed off on her. No camera coverage anywhere in the Directorate's current security feed, because nobody administering that feed remembered the room existed. "We can't hide here forever," Sail said, sitting very still on the cold floor with her back against the old door's inner frame, banner clutched tight. "We don't need forever," Mari said, checking the corridor junction box behind the chapel's altar niche with hands that had gone steady the way hands did once a decision stopped being a question. "We need the relay to get an answer before Sesk's people find this room. Adami's buying us time upstairs, feeding them a false sweep pattern, slowing the search wherever he can without making it look deliberate. Is he going to be all right?" Mari didn't have a good answer for that and didn't lie to make one up. "He's careful. He's done this kind of careful a long time." She checked the door's old manual lock, tested the weight of a decommissioned storage rack she'd need 30 seconds to drag into the frame if it came to that, and ran through, one more time, the short list of things this ancient, forgotten room actually had going for it. A door built before anyone trusted electronics to keep people out, a junction box she could overload to kill local power on command, and a girl who had already proven, alone in a burning ship at 9 years old, that she knew how to stay quiet longer than anyone chasing her expected. The alarm reached them at the 11-minute mark, not the chapel's alarm because the chapel had none, but the deep, structural shudder of Adami's diversion finally failing, boots in the corridor above. A voice, Sesk's voice, still maddeningly calm, giving an order Mari couldn't make out the words of but understood completely from its rhythm. They'd found the archive. It wouldn't take them long to find the chapel from there. Sail, Mari crouched in front of her, voice low and level. I need you to listen to me the way you listened to Captain Aura. Whatever happens on the other side of that door, you do not come out. Not for my voice, not for anyone's, until I say the word trust. That's the word. Nothing else. Can you do that? Sail's silver lines pulsed fast under her skin, fear and something harder both at once, and she nodded the same jerky, absolute nod she'd given in the docking bay 2 days ago, except there was nothing frozen in it this time. Trust, she repeated. Okay, I can do that. Mari dragged the storage rack into the door frame, wedged it hard against the old manual lock, and turned to face a corridor she could hear filling with boots on the other side of a door that had been built, a very long time ago, by people who'd never once imagined it would matter this much. They came through 4 minutes later, and it took them longer than 4 minutes to get through, because the door was old patterned steel on real hinges, because the storage rack was heavier than it looked, and because Mari had killed the junction box the instant the first breach charge went active, dropping the corridor beyond into the specific disorienting dark that a station's modern crew, raised on backup lighting that always worked, had never once had to move through by feel. She fought them in that dark the way the Ashford defenders 3 continents over had once fought an entire fleet's ground assault, though Mari Kade had never heard of Ashford Ridge and would not have recognized the comparison if she had, not because the 2 fights shared a battlefield, but because they shared the same oldest lesson in the oldest book. A small space, well known to the person defending it and unknown to the people attacking it, was worth more than the numbers on either side of the door. She knew where the altar niche's edge sat, low and sharp, in absolute dark. She knew where the storage rack's collapsed frame would catch a boot. She knew because she had checked it twice in the 2 hours before the alarm ever sounded, exactly how far the room's old fire suppression line ran, and exactly how much pressure its manual release valve would put out in a space this size. And when the second contractor through the breach found his footing and his weapon at the same moment, Mari opened that valve directly into his face, and used the half-second of pure animal flinch it bought her to put him on the ground with a strike she'd learned in an Earth auxiliary unit that no longer officially existed. A third came through fast on the second's heels, boot catching hard on the collapsed rack's frame exactly where Mari had gambled it would, and she used his stumble the way she'd used everything else in that room, not gracefully, not like anything out of a recording, but with the flat, economical brutality of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that a fight you survived counted as a fight you won regardless of how it looked. She got a forearm under his chin and drove him back into the altar niche's stone edge, and he went down hard enough that he didn't get back up before a fresh light swept the room and found her standing over 2 bodies that weren't dead, just finally, thoroughly, out of the fight. She's alone in there, a voice called back through the breach, and something about the surprise in it, genuine surprise, the specific tone of people who had expected a scared medic and a frightened child and found instead a held room, cost Mari nothing to hear and gave her, for 1 useful second, exactly the hesitation she needed. It cost her anyway. A stray shot from the 4th contractor through the breach caught her along the ribs, not center mass, not through the ballistic weave of her warden's jacket, but enough to fold half her breath out of her lungs and put her down on 1 knee against the altar niche with pain that turned the dark room briefly, dangerously white at the edges. Kade, Sesk's voice from the breach still impossibly, infuriatingly calm. Stand down. You've assaulted 2 Directorate contractors and obstructed a lawful transfer. Whatever grievance you believe you're carrying, this is not a fight your tributary status survives. Mari got her breath back by force, got her feet back under her by more force than that, and put herself between the breach and the sealed inner door where Sail sat silent and unmoving, exactly where she'd been told to stay. You signed off on the man who tried to kill her, Mari said, voice rough but steady. I've got your seal on his credentials, Sesk. I've got Corvin's weapons signature on the convoy attack, confirmed 3 ways. I've got a 9-year-old's eyewitness account of the hull that fired on her own escort. That's not a grievance. That's evidence, and it's already sitting on a council relay this station's warden captain triggered 4 hours ago, waiting on a magistrate to open it. For the first time since Mari had met him, something in Sesk's carefully correct posture actually cracked. Not fear, not yet, but the cold, fast recalculation of a man who had just heard a number he hadn't priced into his plan. That relay requires warden captain authorization, he said. A daemie wouldn't. He already did, Mari said. Which means whatever happens in the next 60 seconds, Overseer, it's not happening quietly anymore. You should understand what you're spending, Kade, before you spend the last of it. Sesk's voice hadn't changed, but something under it had the specific flatness of a man reciting a fact he found genuinely unfortunate rather than useful. Earth has no fleet in this system, no ambassador in this chamber, 9 years of provisional standing, and not one vote on any board that will ever review tonight. Whatever you believe you're protecting her from, you are doing it with nothing behind you but a warden captain's authorization, and a door that will not hold much longer. Then it's a good thing the door already held long enough, Mari said. The amber light on the relay's status panel, 3 decks up. In the archive nobody had thought to guard because nobody administering the search had known it was the room that mattered, turned green 9 seconds after Sesk stopped speaking. And the acknowledgement that finally came through carried a priority flag that every automated system on Halworth Station, Directorate administered or not, was hard-coded, since before any current staff member had been born, to obey without question. First Advocate Ren Isset had been reviewing a routine tribute dispute in her chambers on Council Prime, 3 transit days from Halworth Station by any conventional channel, when the emergency relays packet reached her desk with an authentication chain clean enough that her staff didn't even query it before routing it directly to her personal terminal. A convoy's weapons telemetry, a forged credentials approval seal, a child's trace testimony, and a live audio feed still transmitting. Of an overseer's voice arguing with a warden 3 levels below council notice about whether evidence that had just reached a sitting magistrate's desk still counted as quiet. It did not take her long to decide it didn't. The order that reached Halworth Station's local security grid 4 minutes later came with a magistrate's seal that outranked every directorate authorization on the moon, all at once, all together. Full lockdown of the transfer escort, immediate cessation of any custody action regarding designation 614, and a formal notice, routed simultaneously to Overseer Sesk's own credential terminal, that First Advocate Isset would be convening an emergency session of the Repatriation Oversight Board within 6 hours, and that Overseer Padron Sesk's personal attendance was, as the notice put it with the same flat, unbothered precision Sesk himself had used on Mari 2 days earlier. Not optional. Sesk read the notice on his own wrist display, standing in the doorway of a chapel he could no longer legally enter. And for the first time in 3 years of watching bureaucrats work a system built to protect itself, Mari saw one of them run out of calm. "This isn't finished," he said, and it came out sounding less like a threat than like a man rehearsing a sentence he no longer believed. "No," Mari agreed, still on one knee, one hand pressed hard against her ribs, the other braced against the sealed inner door behind which a 9-year-old girl had just heard, for the first time in 4 days, an adult's voice she trusted say a word that meant it was finally safe to move. "It isn't. Trust, Sale. You can come out now." The 6 hours between the chapel door opening and the board session convening were the strangest of Mari's 3 years on Halworth Station. Not quiet, exactly, but quiet in the specific way a station goes when an emergency has stopped being an emergency and started being a procedure. Everyone moving with the brisk, careful competence of people who understood, without being told twice, that whatever came next would be reviewed by someone who mattered. Medical took Ademi first. A stun round's burn scored deep across his left shoulder from covering their run through the corridors, and it was there, propped up on a gurney with a field dressing already soaking through, that he told Mari the part of the plan he hadn't mentioned before triggering the relay. First Advocate Iset doesn't attend Directorate custody disputes, he said, wincing as a nurse tightened the dressing. She sits on treaty violations, war crimes referrals, the kind of case that gets a magistrate's personal name attached to the ruling because nobody wants their name attached to it instead. I didn't send that packet to whoever was on duty, Kade. I sent it flagged for her desk specifically, because a fleet weapons signature striking an unarmed refugee convoy isn't a custody dispute anymore. It's exactly her kind of case. I gambled that once she saw it, she wouldn't be able to hand it back down to someone smaller. You gambled her attention on a hunch. I gambled her attention on 6 years of reading which magistrates actually open the packets their staff forward and which ones don't, Ademi said. It's not a hunch if you've done the homework first. Sale, sitting on a stool beside the gurney with the banner across her knees, had said very little through any of it. Not frightened silence this time, Mari thought, watching her, but the focused quiet of someone conserving whatever she had left for whatever came next. When the board's transit authorization finally arrived, routed through a council fast lane reserved for exactly this class of emergency, and cutting the ordinary 3-day transit down to under an hour, Sale folded the banner into the careful, deliberate shape she'd learned from her mother and tucked it inside her jacket rather than carrying it visibly. You don't have to hide it, Mari said. I know. Sale looked up, silver line steady. I'm not hiding it. I'm keeping both hands free. I want them to see my face when I answer questions, not my house's device. The device already told them who I used to be. I'd rather they look at who I am while they decide what happens next. Mari didn't have an answer for that either. She was starting to understand that she wasn't going to have one for most of what this girl said, and that this, too, was something she was going to have to get used to. The Repatriation Oversight Board convened 6 hours later in a chamber Mari had never set foot in and would remember afterward, in fragments too vivid to be anything but real. A curved gallery of seats rising in tiers around a central floor, a dozen species represented among the seated magistrates, screens along the upper wall displaying, live, the raw evidence packet Ademi had triggered the relay to send weapons telemetry, forged credentials, a station security feed of an armed escort breaching a locked door, all of it laid open in front of representatives from across the council's reach. In a room built specifically, so that nothing decided in it could later be described as private. First Advocate Ren Iset presided from the highest tier, a tall, silver-eyed presence whose species Mari didn't recognize and whose voice, when it came, carried none of Sesk's careful softness, flat, exact, and entirely unwilling to let a single fact in the packet go unstated for the comfort of anyone in the room. Overseer Sesk. Iset's gaze didn't waver from the man standing at the chamber floor's center podium, alone, without the calm, unhurried posture he'd carried through every previous encounter Mari had witnessed. You will confirm or deny, for this board's record. Did you authorize the credential set used by the individual identified as Vec Asen to gain access to designation 614 inside a secured medical facility? I signed a contracting authorization within the scope of my directorate role, Sesk said, and his voice, for the first time, carried a strain that sounded almost like the truth trying to get out from under years of careful phrasing. I did not knowingly authorize an assassination attempt. The subcontract chain through which that individual's credentials were issued is a chain with your seal on the originating document, Iset said. 4 hours before you personally informed this board's own warden captain that a kinship reclamation statute existed at all. You will have the opportunity to answer for the sequence of those two events in a formal inquiry. This board is opening as of this session. That is not the question in front of us today." She turned, and for the first time since the chamber's doors had opened, her attention settled fully on the small figure standing beside Mari at the floor's edge, sail, banner still clutched in both hands, silver lines pulsing visibly under the chamber's bright, even light, standing very straight in a room built for beings twice her size. "Sail Vantic," Iset said, and something in the way she used the full name, deliberately, formally, the second word restored to a girl who had been told for 4 days to keep it hidden, made the whole gallery go still in a way no gavel could have produced. "Would you like to speak before this board rules?" It was, Mari noticed, an actual question, offered, not required, in a chamber that had spent the last 4 days treating the girl's voice as something to be managed rather than heard. Sail looked up at the tiers of magistrates, at screens taller than she was replaying evidence of her own convoy burning, and did not flinch from any of it. "My mother's name was Elira Vantic," she said, clearly, in trade tongue steadier than it had been on the docking bay floor 2 days before. "She told me once that if a government has to lie about how a child died, it means the child still matters more than the lie is worth. I don't know if that's true of governments generally. I know it was true of the Corvin Assembly, because they didn't shoot me on the ship, and they had every chance to. They wanted paperwork instead. I'd like the record to say a 9-year-old worked that out for herself, 4 days after her mother died, before any adult explained it to her." The gallery held that silence a moment longer than protocol required. The recalibrating kind, not the reverent kind. Several tiers of representatives visibly recalculating exactly how much translation a refugee child's testimony had needed before any of them thought to actually listen to it. "This board has reviewed weapons telemetry, confirming a Corvin Assembly naval vessel fired on your convoy without provocation. It has reviewed a forged credential chain that placed an armed operative inside your medical custody within hours of your arrival at this station. And it has reviewed a kinship reclamation statute request, filed by the same government whose naval vessel attacked you, seeking your custody under the pretense of family return." Iset's silver eyes did not soften, but something in them settled decisively into a verdict already reached. This board did not require a 9-year-old's account to reach its conclusion. It required considerably less courage than she just showed to hear it anyway. "I would like the record to show, for every world watching this session, exactly whose account this council chose to believe first, and exactly how long it took a child to say a truth. Every adult administrator in this chain had 4 days and a statute clock to avoid hearing." She looked then directly at Mari, not at the warden captain, not at any directorate representative, but at the auxiliary human medic still standing with one hand pressed against bruised ribs, who had spent 39 hours refusing to let a statute's clock decide a child's life for her. "Warden Kade," Iset's voice carried deliberately to every tier of the gallery, "your tributary status affords you no formal standing to bring evidence before this board. You did so regardless. At personal and professional risk, this record will reflect in full. This board is not in the practice of publicly commending auxiliary staff for actions outside their authorized duties." A pause, precise and unhurried, the kind that every seated magistrate in the gallery understood as its own kind of statement. "It is, however, in the practice of asking why a council administrator with full statutory authority required a station medic with none to do the job the statute was supposed to guarantee. That is the question this session is actually here to answer, and I intend for every representative in this chamber to sit with it for exactly as long as it takes to be uncomfortable." The gallery did not fall silent because it had not been noisy, but something in the collective posture of a dozen species representatives shifted, all at once, in a way Mari would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for, and eventually settle on simply recalibration. Not shock in the sense of surprise at a fact. The facts were on the screens, undeniable, already reviewed. Shock in the older sense, the sense of a structure absorbing a force it had not built itself to absorb, and having to decide, in front of everyone watching, whether it would hold or bend. The board's ruling took 40 minutes to draft and was delivered, in full, before the session closed. Sale Vantic granted permanent council-protected status, custody vested in Halworth Relief Station pending formal guardianship review, with First Advocate Isset personally noting for the record that any future kinship reclamation request touching this case would require the board's direct, unanimous authorization, a procedural change that Mari would learn later from Adami with the flat satisfaction of a man who'd spent 6 years fighting the Directorate's paperwork and finally won a round that mattered, effectively closed the exact loophole Sesk statute had used. The Corvin Assembly's ambassador to the council, present in the gallery and visibly unhappy about it, was formally noticed of an independent investigation into the convoy attack, with the weapons telemetry entered as founding evidence. The ambassador rose before the notice finished being read into the record, objecting that the Assembly's sovereign right to manage its own succession disputes could not be superseded by a council board acting on the testimony of an unaccompanied minor and a tributary auxiliary with no diplomatic standing. Isset let him finish. It was, Mari understood watching her, a deliberate courtesy extended specifically so that its absence afterward would be unmistakable. Ambassador, this board has watched your government's own naval telemetry confirm a first strike engagement against an unarmed refugee convoy, Isset said. It has watched a forged credential trace back to a signature applied hours before your directorate liaison ever mentioned a statute to the people protecting that convoy's sole survivor. Sovereignty is not a shield against evidence your own Hull registries generated. If the Assembly wishes to contest this investigation's findings, it may do so through the same evidentiary process every other tribute government uses, by providing better evidence, not louder objections. She did not raise her voice to say it, and the not raising, Mari thought, was somehow worse for the ambassador than shouting would have been. Sit down. He sat, and the investigation notice finished reading into the record. The kind of investigation, Isset added afterward dryly, that tended to move considerably faster once a council board's own magistrates had watched the raw footage themselves, rather than reading a summary somebody else had written. Overseer Padron Sesk did not leave the chamber a free administrator. The formal inquiry into his credential authorization opened that same session, and whatever its final finding, negligence, complicity, or the specific bureaucratic cowardice of a man who had simply stopped looking closely enough at what he signed. His career on this directorate's ladder ended in that room, in front of every representative who would ever again read his name in a file. The procedural change didn't stop at Sale's case file. Within a month, First Advocate Isset's ruling had been cited twice more by other council boards reviewing kinship reclamation requests on stations Mari had never heard of, each one now required to clear the same direct, unanimous authorization the loophole had never previously demanded. Adami called it, with the particular satisfaction of a man who measured victories in closed loopholes rather than headlines. The quietest kind of winning there is the kind where nobody has to fight this exact fight again. The Directorate issued no public statement about it. It didn't need to. Every station administrator who read the ruling understood exactly which sentence in it had been written with Padron Sesk's name still fresh in the file. Adami had taken a contractor's stun round across the shoulder during the corridor diversion 3 decks above the chapel, a wound that put him in the station's medical bay for 6 days and left his left arm slower than it used to be for good. A cost he named plainly, without self-pity, the first time Mari visited him there. Slower's not the same as gone, he told her, watching Sale from his cot as the girl carefully rearranged the pillows on his bed into a configuration only she seemed to understand the logic of. "I'll take slower. I've seen worse trades." Mari's ribs healed in 4 weeks, faster than her ability to walk past the old relay chapel without her pulse climbing, though that, too, faded eventually, the way most things did once enough ordinary days had been stacked on top of the bad one. 6 weeks after the board's ruling, Sale Vantic sat in the same corridor of Haworth Station, where a triage sweep had once walked past her twice, this time on an actual chair, in a section of the crew quarters that had been quietly, informally converted into something that looked less like a processing facility and more like a home, and worked at teaching Mari to fold the scorched banner into a shape that no longer looked like wreckage. "You do it wrong every time," Sale informed her, without looking up, in the particular tone of a 9-year-old who had appointed herself an authority and intended to hold the position indefinitely. "I'm learning. You've had 6 weeks. Some of us weren't raised folding heraldry, Sale." Mari watched the girl's hands work, steady now, sure of themselves in a way they hadn't been in a docking bay 6 weeks ago, silver lines pulsing calm and even beneath skin that had stopped flinching at footsteps in the corridor outside. "You could teach me properly instead of judging my technique." Sale considered this with the gravity she brought to most things, then held the banner out, corner first, and guided Mari's hands through the fold with a patience that would have surprised the girl who'd once refused to say her own name out loud. "There," she said, when the fabric finally sat right, the ruined embroidery visible but no longer raw, folded into something that looked, for the first time since a burning ship 4,000 light-years away, deliberately kept rather than merely saved. "That's how you do it when it's not falling apart anymore." Mari looked at the small, precise fold in her hands, at the girl beside her who had spent 2 impossible days learning exactly how much of the galaxy's machinery would move finally, when someone simply refused to let it grind past her, and understood, with the particular quiet certainty she'd carried since a corridor full of dark and gunfire, that this was not an ending anyone would have written into a statute. It was better than that, it was just true. "Yeah," Mari said, "that's how you do it."